Ford, and I'm the General Manager of the Brazos River Authority. Before I make some introductions, I want to tell you that I want to thank you for coming. But number two, as of 10 minutes ago, we still up at the PK, we still haven't found the young man protected the ground. The mic's on. We thought we had this, we tested it. I apologize. I even bought new speakers that says, but I hate that sound. I can't hear you. Okay. All right, now I'm sure I talk loud. Okay, my name is Phil Ford. I'm the General Manager of the Brazos River Authority. The young man who we've been looking for a couple of days under the PK as of 10 minutes ago has not been found. So we're still looking for him. Our thoughts and prayers with his family. We have a couple of elected officials either represented or here tonight. Diane Williamson from Congressman Floyd's office. Thank you for coming, Diane. Ben Stratman and Taylor Blackburn from Senator Birdwell's office. Also, Steve Berry of Hood County Commissioners here. We have two directors from the Brazos River Authority Board of Directors, Chris Adams and Paul Christensen. So thank y'all for coming. Next slide. The purpose of this meeting is we're on a timeline. At the end of November, we have to submit our water management plan. We also, and we're going to take you through the whole process, how you get involved in the process, how many people have voted so far in the process. And we're going to take you through slide by slide and all that stuff here in a few minutes, so we'll for you with that. But the purpose is for us to go back through the process, back to the TECQ, allow TECQ some time to look at it, then we go down to the ALJs, the judge, and it's basically a trial. And we have to stand up and defend our position, and that their recommendation depends on what we tell them and what the people who disagree with us and protest us tell them. They make a judgment, and then they send that to the TCQ commissioners, and they vote. And that's about 2 years away from now, whenever they vote after we go through this process. So we're here today primarily to talk about the process, talk about the studies, talk about the conclusions of the studies, talk about what y'all said, talk about what we said to you. And but the main purpose is for you to see what the results of the water management plan. That's where we are in the process. So at this time, the Upper Basin manager, Mike McClellan, will start off and take us through the process. Mike.
Thank you. I'm Mike McClendon. We show this slide at all of our presentations. Almost every presentation that I've ever given, this is incorporated in there. And there's kind of two things that I want you to take away from this slide. Number one, if you look at it, you can see the vastness of the Brazos River Basin. It stretches from the Texas-Mexico border all the way down to the Gulf of Freeport. The other thing that I'd like you to notice is also our mission statement, which is to develop, manage, and protect the water resources of the Brazos Basin. I understand that many of you are here tonight and you're concerned with individual reservoirs. Our job is to look at the system as a whole, look at it collectively, and then manage our water supplies, and then manage those individual reservoirs as equitably as possible. As Phil said, tonight we're going to talk about the water management plan. There's going to be some detailed information, technical information. Some of you may be interested in that, some of you may not. Just bear with us. We'll walk through that process. Also, based upon some of the meetings that we've had, some of the comments on to our website, I'm going to walk through about 4 or 5 questions that are kind of common questions that have been asked, and I'll go over those. Prior to doing that, though, I'm going to go ahead. There may be some folks that haven't attended some of the prior meetings. I'll walk through some background information, and then I'll get to some of those questions, and then I'll turn it over to Brad Burnett. The Brazos River Authority has existing water supplies or existing water right permits from the TCQ in each of these reservoirs, and the TCQ stipulates how that water can be utilized. The TCQ, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, is a state agency that has jurisdiction over water rights. I'm going to talk about acre feet here in a minute. It's just a unit of measure. For some of you folks, 1 acre foot is 325,851 gallons. Basically, it's the amount of water that it would take to cover 1 acre, 1 foot deep in water. From this map, you can see that we have 11 reservoirs. Our total permitted diversions equals about 661,000 acre-feet of water. We also have a contract with LCRA, provides an additional 25,000 acre-feet of water. And then we have an agreement through some other agreements where there's an additional about 18,000 acre-feet of water. So the total permitted water rights is about, that we have available to sell, is about 704,000 acre-feet. The Brazos River Authority, the reservoirs up there that you see, Possum Kingdom, Granbury, and Lake Limestone, we constructed, own, and operate those reservoirs. We also have additional water supply storage in 8 of the reservoirs, which are U.S. Army Corps of Engineer reservoirs. In return for that water supply that we have in those 8 federal reservoirs, we pay for the construction costs, the debt service for the construction of those reservoirs, and also the annual portion of the annual O&M costs associated with that. And almost all the water that you see here, that 704,000 that I mentioned, is already committed under existing long-term water contracts. This slide shows us, shows our top 10 water customers, and it shows in terms of how much water is contracted. Luminant is one of our bigger customers, and you can see that they divert water for their power generation facility for cooling purposes if the water comes from PK, Granbury, and they also have a facility over on Limestone. NRG, another customer that is involved in power generation, they have a facility there at Limestone, and then there's also one on the main stem down near Richmond, which is at the bottom of the slide. With the exception of Dow Chemical, which is also located down there around Freeport, the other 10 customers, or the other customers that are shown on this slide, the water is used for municipal purposes. And these 10 customers account for about 70% of our contracted water that we have. This slide provides you a little bit more detail about where our existing long-term water contracts are located. From the slide, it shows that we divided the basin into about 27 different segments. The blue bars are scaled based upon the amount of water that's currently under contract in those specific reaches or those specific segments. For example, if you will look up here in stream segment 4 here, that's the area that stretches from the Dennis Gauge, which is upstream of Lake Granbury, down to the Lake Granbury Dam. There's about 89,000 acre-feet of water that is contracted for under long-term contracts within that reach. The diversions that are shown in the tables down at the bottom defines all the segments, and it shows, it's got a listing of the amount of water that's available in each different segment there. What we're proposing to do today through our water management plan with the additional water through the system operations permit is to meet the needs of the state water plan, and we would propose to meet some of those demands. There's about 100,000 acre-feet in what we define as our upper and central basin, and then there's about an additional 25,000 acre-feet that's needed in our lower basin. The Brazos River Authority submitted our system operations permit to the TCQ in 2004. The permit's going to authorize the use of water for VRA's existing reservoirs in conjunction with the naturally occurring flows downstream. The permit would also authorize the use of existing return flows from wastewater treatment plants, and those are discharged back into the river. In addition, the permit would also authorize, or not authorize, it would require the Brazos River Authority to be compliant with the environmental flow regime standards, which are being developed by TCQ and which are also already incorporated into our permit. Brazos River Authority, if the permit were issued, would utilize the water from our sister operations permit in accordance with the Texas Water Code. From this slide, you can see the preferences of how that water is appropriated in order in terms of use. You can see domestic and municipal use is first, then agricultural use, then mining, followed by hydroelectric, then navigation, then recreational pleasure, and then other beneficial uses. This next slide shows the current status of the permit. The TCQ commissioners took action or considered the permit back in January of this year. They forwarded that to the State Office of Administrative Hearings, which is SOA. SOA then said for the BRA to develop a water management plan. The Brazos River Authority was already in the process of doing that. Their actions required the development of a water management plan. It just expedited the process earlier than what we had originally planned. As Phil mentioned, the Brazos River Authority is going to submit the water management plan to the TCQ in November of this year. TCQ will then take about 7 months to look at the permit. They're going to prepare a new draft permit, and then they'll kind of explain or publish notice for their process. After TCQ gets through looking at the permit, it'll go back over to the State Office of Administrative Hearings. They'll hold a contested case hearing. They'll prepare a proposal for decision, and then it'll be sent back over to the TCQ commissioners for further consideration. This slide shows you some of the stakeholder meetings like we're in tonight that we're holding. The meetings in June provided background information and basically explained the process and the schedule of where we're going to come out and meet. I think we've held, this will be our 7th meeting tonight, and we'll hold 2 more within the basin. In August, we introduced information with regard to some of the environmental studies that have been taken, undertaken to date. And we also rolled out some of the first information that we had with regard to the modeling efforts to date. Later, when Brad gets up here, he's going to talk about our water supply operations and some of the additional modeling efforts that we've taken since we last met. And then I'll come back and I'll explain how everybody can become part of the process after the meetings have taken place. This slide shows kind of the public participation to date. As you can see, we've had about 9,000 hits on our website. The attendance at the 6 public meetings has been pretty good. We've got 2 more to go, one tomorrow and then one the following day. And you can also see that several folks have taken advantage of our website in which they've offered questions, and we've answered those on a weekly basis. And that's kind of a good segue into the next question, or the first question. There were probably, like I said, about 4 or 5 questions that were asked, and that kind of dominated the Q&A process. Probably one of the most asked questions was, what will the impact be upon the lakes? This slide looks at it from a collective or holistic standpoint. It looks at the system in total. Under current conditions with the system operations permit, under current conditions without the system operations permit, 50% of the time the system will be 96% full or greater, and then at the lowest model storage it will be around 42% full. And then if we look in advance in 2060, and if we look with the new nuclear reactors with Comanche Peak and also with the system operations permit, we anticipate that the system will be 93% full over half the time, with the lowest model storage about 28% full. We'll answer that, if you don't mind. I'll let Brad answer that at the end of the question. If you'll hold your question till the end, and then we'll come back to that. Another question was asked if we consider the economic impacts of taking additional water. We don't spend a lot of time on that. The idea being that the lakes were constructed for storage of water and usage, and also for flood control purposes. We have looked at the economic impacts of not supplying the water based upon the state water plan, and you can see from these numbers the cost is very severe if we don't meet the needs of the state water plan, and the costs are in the billions of dollars. I mean, quite frankly, whenever you look at it today, our state has done relatively well. The economy has, relative to the rest of the state, but we need water for electric purposes to supply our electric facilities. We need water for a growing population, and we need water for industry. Another question that was asked is, what's the BRA going to do with the water from the permit? I said earlier that we're going to use about 100,000 acre feet within Region G, or it's called Brazos G. That's one of the planning groups. And then the other area, we use about 25,000 acre feet of water, and that's in Region H, which is in our lower basin. Yeah, this is taken directly from the state water plan. Brazos G is one of the one of the 26 regional water planning groups, and then you've got Region H. And also located within the Brazos Basin, there's Region O. I didn't show that on this slide because it's upstream of Possum Kingdom primarily. So these are some of the economics losses of not meeting the needs of the state water plan, the defined needs. Through the state water plan, it's showing like regional income will drop, and that's how you read this. The state business local taxes, these are losses in dollars, in millions of dollars, and up to billions of dollars. You'll see population losses, declines in school enrollment, and so forth. And I'll have these slides available to you. We'll post them on our website if you want to look at them. And then if you have questions after that, you can submit those. At the end of this presentation, I'll show you a slide where you can submit your questions too. That'll give you time to look over this in greater detail. This information was taken from the State Water Plan 2012, and it's also available online if you'd like to read through that further. This is region by region. There's 26 different planning regions within the state of Texas. This map's kind of hard to see. You can see Region G. It goes up to almost the Cap Rock right here, and then comes down to, I guess, is that limestone area? Yeah, Washington County. So you can, this area right here, which includes Hood, Somerville County, is all included within Region G. And then Region H is down here at the lower portion of our basin. Question was, what is the BRA going to do with the water from the permit? As I said, 100,000 acre feet, Brazos G, 25,000 in Region H. Another question that was asked was, what about what other measures are the BRA and the state taking to meet those needs that are defined in the state water plan? One of those is obviously our system operations permits. We're also, we collectively, the state, are looking at conservation measures as well as reuse projects. And reuse projects can be something like direct reuse, where you take water from a wastewater treatment plant and that's used to water a golf course, a park, or even industry. There's some power plants, small power plants that utilize that water as well. I know the one in the Cleveland area that does that. Other means that we're looking at is also using water conjunctively. You use water, groundwater, and surface water at the same time. Some of the other means that we're looking at is also the conveyance of water. A lot of times the water is not where the population centers are, so you have to build infrastructure to get it to where the population centers are. That's a very expensive undertaking, but there's many people in the state that are undertaking that. Other methods that we're looking at, desalinization of either brackish water or seawater. And then we're also looking at the construction of new reservoirs. Our Allen's Peak project, which is located in the lower basin, is an example of a new reservoir that we anticipate coming online. Lastly, I guess one of the questions that was also most often asked was, where does the water come from? It comes from primarily 4 different components. I mentioned the one earlier, it's the increased use of natural flows downstream of our reservoirs. Number 2 would be, and that would be contingent upon the existing water supply, the existing water right holders, and also the environmental flow regimes that would be restricted upon that. Number 2 would be the return flows. And then we also have the supplies within the existing reservoirs exceed the authorization of the BRA's current existing water rights. What that means is, take Possum Kingdom for example, and this is where most of that water is. There's more water available in Possum Kingdom than what's issued on our water right. We've got better modeling techniques, and we can tell that there's additional water in those existing reservoirs. And then the last option is, or the last means of where the water comes from is you develop a system efficiency. And basically what this means is that all 11 reservoirs aren't going to be experiencing a drought of record at the same time. And then the reservoirs can usually supply more than their firm yield. And that's a few of the questions. As I said earlier, if you'll hold your question at the end, we'll get back to that. I can't remember exactly who asked that. I'm going to turn it over to Brad Burnett right now, and he's going to walk you through some of the modeling efforts that we've done today.
Good evening. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind everyone, those of you that have been at some of the other stakeholder meetings have seen this slide here. And basically, we're talking about the water management plan tonight. And when we talk about that plan, these are the major categories that we've got that are going to make up that plan. So ultimately, when we submit this to the TCEQ in November, everything that we've been working on and developing is going to be plugged into these 6 categories that you see right here. We're posting that information out on the website as we have it available. We've got information out there on sections 2 and 3. And since our meetings in August, we've been working primarily on section 4 and section 6, and we recently got started on the details of section 5. Tonight, what I'm going to focus on and talk specifically about is information that's going to be in section 4 on our water supply operations. I think that's the question that we get most interest from folks on is how we're operating the reservoirs and what are we thinking whenever we're making decisions. This slide here, when we talk about water supply operations, when we use that terminology, in my mind, just to make sure we're on the same page with what we're talking about, but in my mind when I'm talking about water supply operations, I'm talking about the 3 categories that you see here on this slide. It's our customers that use water and divert water directly from the lakes and send that water to their treatment plant or their facility or wherever they're using it. We also have a couple of pipelines in the basin where we transport water from one reservoir to another or one location to another. Those are fairly isolated, and so most folks aren't that interested in those unless you're one of the direct customers of them. And then downstream releases. And of these 3 that I've got listed up here, it's that downstream release category that most everyone is interested in, regardless if you're at Lake Granbury or Possum Kingdom Lake or at Lake Somerville. And so I'm going to talk a little bit in the next several slides about some of the things that we consider when we're making downstream water supply releases. So what is BRE thinking when you see them releasing water? One of the first things that we consider when we have one of our customers that calls and says we need a water release, we've got some customers that may only be located downstream of one reservoir. And so there's really no option other than that reservoir to get water to them. We've got others, though, that may be located in the lower part of the basin where we could feasibly get water to them from any of those 11 reservoirs that Mike showed to you earlier. So, that's the first question is where are they and what's available to us. We also look at how soon they need the water and how much water that they need, how far downstream they are. All the reservoirs are located across that basin map that you saw earlier, and so a water supply release from Possum Kingdom, it might take 2 weeks or more for that water to make it down to the lower part of the basin, versus Lake Somerville that's located closely, we can get water down to that area in a matter of a few days. One of the other things that we consider in the case of a lot of our customers are small users that are downstream, and almost all of these reservoirs have some water that leaks through them. Even if we've got all the gates closed, there's some leakage that exists through most all of these reservoirs. It's larger for some than others, but there is some leakage there. And so for some of our smaller customers that are diverting relatively small amounts, if we know that they're diverting what's leaking from the reservoir, may be enough to cover that customer's needs. We also have some customers, and I'll use Lake Belton in the city of Temple as an example. The city of Temple has a intake structure just downstream of the dam at Lake Belton, and so that's our only way to get water to them is releasing it from Lake Belton. And they have a little low water dam on the Leon River there, so that when we're releasing water, we keep that impoundment full so that their pumps can operate appropriately. And what we typically do is we maintain the release slightly above what they're pumping, just to ensure that their expensive pumps and infrastructure don't run out of water and cavitate and cause them a lot of problems. And a lot of times what we're releasing for the city of Temple may be more than what they're taking. And so then if we have another customer further downstream, let's say it's the summertime and we've got a downstream customer that needs water, there may already be some water that's getting past Temple that's coming out of Lake Belton that we could allocate for that customer. Beyond that, if we have a customer that's located downstream of multiple reservoirs that needs a large release, we look at a number of factors associated with each one of those reservoirs. We look at how full are they relative to other reservoirs in the basin. We look at the inflow. Is one area of the basin wetter than another? And we see that sometimes. We've got a large basin, and so sometimes we may have one reservoir where we have some inflow coming into the reservoir versus others where we don't. We also look at how much water is needed and being used locally from the reservoir. A lot of our reservoirs have a lot of users that use water there locally, and so we're not as able to make releases from those reservoirs because we've got a number of entities that depend on the water there locally. Another thing that we take into account is our customers' intake structures. I mentioned lakeside customers earlier. We've got a lot of customers that have intake structures in these lakes, and those intake structures are located at various depths. And so we've never had an issue in our history to date of having a lake get so low that we jeopardize the customer's intake structure. But that is something that we have to take into account. It's not something that we can guarantee our customers. When you sign a water contract with the Brazos River Authority, we're just obligating ourselves to make the water available, but we don't obligate ourselves to make sure that your intake is protected. But nonetheless, that's something that we consider. Obviously, we're not going to jeopardize a city's water supply or something of that nature by releasing from one reservoir versus another if we can avoid it. So that's something that we look at. We also do give some consideration to recreational impacts. I know that's a big frustration around lakes whenever they get low, particularly in the summertime whenever you expect your people to be using the lakes. When boat ramps aren't usable and docks aren't usable, we know that those recreational impacts are there, and we try to avoid those when we can. But unfortunately, when we have years like 2011 and really dry years, the lakes are going to go down. On the flip side of that, we also give consideration to recreational needs downstream of the reservoirs. We have a number of folks that live downstream of these lakes that depend on water in the river downstream. And particularly here where we are today at Glen Rose is probably the greatest example of that we get the most calls into our office about, and recreational use on the river here. So we try to time our releases when we are moving water downstream from Possum Kingdom and Granbury. We try to time those releases out of Lake Granbury so that we're releasing the water on a Thursday or a Friday so that it puts water here through the Glen Rose area on the weekend. Again, we're not able to do that all the time, just like we aren't able to keep the lakes full all the time, but we do try to give those considerations when we can. In 2011, it's kind of counterintuitive when you think about the river flow. In 2011, things were probably better here in Glen Rose because it was so dry downstream, we were releasing water from upstream. Whereas this year, the lakes have been okay. People would argue it. The lakes have been okay, but when you look downstream, we haven't had to make the releases for our customers downstream, and so therefore, you haven't seen the flow here through Glen Rose that you did last year. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Another thing that we have to look at are the physical constraints on our ability to release water. And we have pretty fine control over releases in a lot of the reservoirs. In other words, we can release 30 CFS or 35 CFS or pretty much whatever the need is. But on some of the other reservoirs, we may not have that fine control. We may have to go from 20 CFS and the next increment is 50 and the next increment is 100. And so if we have a request that's in between or not quite on target with what the capability of that reservoir is, that's an issue that we have to deal with sometimes as well. Another thing is that these reservoirs that we have, the map that you saw earlier, most all of them were constructed from anywhere from 30 to 70 years ago. And so they're getting old, and a lot of them are requiring maintenance and rehabilitation. And whenever that's going on, a lot of times our ability to release water gets impacted by that. If you look at Lake Belton as an example of that, in the latter part of 2010, the Corps of Engineers was doing some work on the gate structures there at Lake Belton. And in 2010 was a pretty wet year, and so when they started that project, there weren't any issues out there. But that project carried over into 2011, and most of the year in 2011, with the exception of the Temple release downstream, we weren't able to make releases out of Lake Belton because of that project that they were working on with the gates there. And so that's an unfortunate reality that we have to deal with occasionally. It's not all the time, but it does come up. We also try to use the reservoirs as efficiently as we can when we're considering the time it takes for water to get to customers' locations and the loss of water in transit. We do lose some water. When it's really dry, we lose more water than when it's not so dry. Lake Somerville, again, is the lowest reservoir that we have in the system. It's closer to the downstream customers, and so we typically use it first, and we use it more heavily than we do reservoirs further up in the basin. And that was the case in 2011 as well. I think at our lowest point in 2011, Lake Somerville's capacity was down to about 35–38% full. And Lake Somerville is a lot different than the reservoirs up in this part of the basin. In its deepest place, it's about 30 feet deep. And so whenever you talk about a 10-foot drawdown there, the lake was really in unusable shape for the folks in that area. Can we go to the next one? So in addition to these, I've talked through some physical issues that we have to deal with. We've also got some legal and contractual considerations that we have to take into account when we're releasing water when we have requests for releases. We've got, again, the water right permits that Mike showed you earlier, our water right permit for each one of the lakes, and we'll also have a water right permit for the system operation permit that will have additional requirements, and we've got to operate within those parameters. We've also got our contracts with the Corps of Engineers. We have a contract with the Corps for each one of the reservoirs in the basin, and we have to operate within the parameters of those contracts as well. Also, we have to consider downstream senior water right holders, and in many cases, there are water users in the basin that have water rights that predate the reservoirs, and so when we get into times of shortage under state law, if there's inflow to one of our reservoirs that's newer than their water right, then we're not allowed to capture that water in the reservoir. We have to pass it downstream for those senior water rights who had their water rights before the reservoir was built. We also have contracts with a handful of customers that contain drawdown limitations. One of those is at Lake Granbury. When BRA and TXU partnered to build Lake Granbury in the 60s, one of the requirements of the original contract was that we wouldn't draw the lake down below elevation 675. And so that parameter remains in that contract. Also, a new consideration that we've got is maintaining the drawdown protocol between Possum Kingdom and Granbury. And we'll answer questions on that later. I'm not going to get into the specifics now, but most of you are probably somewhat familiar with that. We adopted that in 2011. And so that's something else that we consider now as far as maintaining the drawdown ratio between those two reservoirs. And then the last thing is our drought contingency plan. We obviously have a drought plan that's got different stages and trigger levels that define different actions that our customers are required to undertake. And so when we're getting ready to make a release from one reservoir or another, we do give consideration to those drought trigger levels. And are we going to cause this reservoir to go from a stage 2 condition into a stage 3 condition when this other one's in stage 1? So that's another thing that we look at. Okay. I want to switch gears here a little bit and talk a little bit about expected water use from the system as we move forward into the future under the system operation permit. And just real quickly, one of the things that we mentioned over and over about how we're going to be able to make use of additional water from the system operation permit is that we have a lot of flow in the river a lot of time that's downstream of the reservoirs, and that water isn't necessarily there all of the time, but a lot of the time there's a lot of water in the river downstream. And what you see here on the map is that large white area, and that represents the area of the basin that's downstream of all the reservoirs. And there's a lot of runoff from that part of the basin that we don't actually get to impound or capture in the reservoirs. And so one of the things that we're seeking with this permit is to be able to take advantage of those flows when they're there. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. Another source that we've talked about are the wastewater treatment plant discharges. I believe Mike mentioned those earlier. And this graph shows the actual amount, or the average annual amount of wastewater that's been actually discharged from municipal wastewater treatment plants throughout the basin from 2008 to 2011. You can see most of that's over in the Little River part of the system around Lake Belton and Stonehouse Hollow and in the lower basin. These return flows actually add water back into the river system that isn't historically there before the wastewater plants and entities were using the water. And in TCEQ's standard water right permitting practice, they don't include those flows. So they ignore them as if they're not there in a conservative approach that they take to water right permitting unless someone applies for them. And that's one of the things that we've applied for with our permit application is to make use of some of those return flows. And so in our modeling, we've adjusted the model to account for some of these return flows and being able to take advantage and use those. These next few slides I'm going to show, I've got about 5 scenarios that are listed here, and these are the last 5 slides that we've got. And they show different scenarios of how water may be used in the future from our system with the system operation permit in place. And hopefully, I'm hoping with these slides I can convey the message of how much water are we actually talking about being used from the system under this permit. Excuse me, Mike mentioned earlier that that's one of the questions that we've received over and over is how much water are you going to use, and hopefully with these slides I'll be able to give some indication of what that might look like, even though I can't foretell the future. So the first scenario we're going to look at, let's go back for a second. Just real quickly running through these scenarios. The first one is current conditions, and so it's the baseline. We've taken a model and we've modeled what the river would look like in 2011, or had we had a repeat of 2011. That's kind of the baseline for how much water, the most water we've ever used out of the system today. So that's what we're comparing to. Scenario 2 is expected conditions in 2025, and in that particular scenario, we're assuming we have the system operation permit, but that the Comanche Peak expansion doesn't take place. We don't know whether that ultimately will happen or not, so we're looking at things different ways. Scenario 3 looks at 2025 as well, but in that scenario, we're assuming that that expansion does take place and there's additional water use at the Comanche Peak facility. Scenario 4, we're looking out to 2060 as best we can, looking at projected water use in 2060, 50 years into the future. Scenario 4 is again without Comanche Peak, and Scenario 5 is with Comanche Peak. So let's go through these here quickly if we can. Again, this is the Scenario 1, and this is the current conditions model run. In the water availability model, we talked a little bit about that, and at the last stakeholder meetings, we talked a little bit about how that model works. One of the things that confuses people a lot of times when we're showing these results is we're talking about our 2011 water use in this scenario, which is how much water got used from our system of reservoirs in 2011. And we're going to talk about future water use in the next few slides. But we put up these modeling results that show 1940 to 1996. And so that's confusing to people, and I understand that. Unless you deal with this every day, it can be difficult to follow. But basically, the way I would explain that is we have hydrological records of flow data in the rivers, and we have evaporation data, and we have rainfall data from the past. And you all know that the weather this year isn't like the weather last year, and the weather next year won't be like the weather this year is either. And so when we're looking from a water supply standpoint at what's going to happen to our water supply system, we can't just look at 1 year or another year. We've got to look at multiple years so that we're trying to cover the spectrum of what we see weather-wise. And so what we're doing when we're modeling these current demands, as well as the next slides we're going to look at, we're going back to the historical record, and we're saying we know what the stream flow conditions were like because we had some gauges that existed back then. We have evaporation records from back then. We have rainfall records. So if we could rewind the clock and repeat each one of those years, only now we're going to put the VRE reservoir system in place and we're going to use this much water out of it, what would things look like? And so that's what we're trying to do with the model, and that's the reason that we have that historical period of record there, is because it allows us to see what would happen under different years with different weather. And the more years and the more data we have, the more complete record that we're going to have. Now, what you can see, particularly on this scenario, is that if you look at most of the years, the model estimates that a little over 300,000 or a little under 300,000 acre-feet is needed to meet water needs under our current demands and our current customers and our current contracts. However, you see a few years there with spikes that go up to as much as about 500,000 acre-feet. And that particular spike was in 1956, and that would have been the worst year of the drought record. If our reservoirs had been in existence back then and we had been using water back then, that would have been the worst year that we would have seen it. So the reason that you see those spikes, 1956 being the worst, is that a number of our customers that are in the lower part of the basin have contracts for water with us that are backup water. Most years, they have their own water rights, and there's enough water in the river that they divert water under their own water rights, and we don't ever have to make releases for them in those normal years. But when we have these really dry years, like 1956, and if this chart were extended to 2011, and someday it will be, currently TCEQ hasn't done that yet, but if 2011 were on there, we would see a spike real similar to 1956. So in those really dry years, we have a lot higher water use than we do in most years. 2009, which was also a drought year, a pretty dry year, it wasn't anything like 2011. We had a little over 300,000 acre-feet of water use from the system that year, so it's just a little bit more than most of the bars that you see here. 2010 was a very wet year. All the lakes stayed full pretty much all year long, and we had flooding in June and July. That year, water use from our system was about 238,000. So our water use from our current customers, as well as what we expect in the future, depends on how dry it is. And unfortunately, the drier the river gets, the nature of the beast is that the more water consumers need. So that's current condition. I want you to kind of keep that in mind because that's what we're going to be kind of comparing back to with these next several scenarios. Here we have scenario 2. And again, this shows projected water use in 2025 without the proposed Comanche Peak expansion. We are assuming that we have the system operation permit in place, and in the event that Comanche Peak expansion doesn't take place, then that water that we would make available otherwise there would be made available for water needs down further in the basin in the Region H area. The tops of the bars that you see here are about 100,000 acre-feet higher than they were in the previous slide. So if you look at the tops of most of those bars, we're between 350 and 375,000 acre-feet, whereas the previous slide was slightly under 400,000. So the maximum year there, before we were a little under 500,000, and here 1956 shows 575,000. So we're roughly 100,000 acre-feet more water being used in 2025 in this scenario than current conditions. What this scenario shows that the previous one didn't go were the red portions of those bars. And the red portions of those bars represent water that would be used under the system operation permit, which is mostly those unappropriated flows in a river downstream and those wastewater return flows. In the dry years like 1956, the red bars are very small again because when we have dry years, there's not a lot of leftover water available in the river. And so in those dry years, we have to meet those needs with more of the reservoir releases. In this case, most of the red bars are anywhere from 50 to 80,000 acre-feet, but you can see they change from year to year, and that's due to the nature that we have some dry years and some wet years thrown in there, and that's, again, why we're looking at this longer period of record. Okay, let's go to the next one. This is scenario 3, which is 2025 conditions with the proposed Comanche Peak expansion. And here, the water use in most of the years is 125 to 150,000 acre-feet per year higher than under current conditions. So we've got a little higher use a little sooner. If the Comanche Peak expansion takes place, it's not like a municipality that slowly grows through time and uses a little more water each year. If that expansion takes place, they'll perform the construction and build the expansion, and then one day they'll turn the thing on, and from that day forward we'll be using kind of a stepwise increase in water as opposed to a slower growth rate with the municipal use. So we're a little bit higher here in 2025 than we were in the non-Comanche Peak scenario that we just looked at. And in this scenario, the majority of the water that's available through the proposed permit is sold higher up in the basin at Lake Granbury. And so one of the things that we tried to communicate from the beginning is ultimately how much water we can make available from our system depends on where it's sold. And if we sell water further up in the basin, naturally that means there's a factor that we can sell less down lower. And so that's what you see here on this scenario, that because we're selling that water higher up in the basin, you see the red bars there are smaller than they were on the previous slide. So we sell less water in the lower part of the basin, and therefore there's less customers to take advantage of those flows that are down there. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. And here, again, we're moving from 2025 to 2060. Here we're in 2060 without the Comanche Peak expansion. We're looking at the same charts here, the same division, only we're looking further out into the future. And so we've got more water being used, not only under the system operation permit, but under our existing water rights and our contracts. When we look out to 2060 here, we're not necessarily selling more water, so don't look at this as VRAs entering more contracts. It's just the existing water contracts that we have today before we get the system operation permit, and those contracts that we'll enter, assuming we do get the permit. This is the total water use under all of those that we would expect in 2060. Here, the red bars where we're taking advantage of those flows in the lower part of the basin are about 200,000 acre-feet in the wet years. This scenario is compared to about 80,000 acre-feet in 2025. And again, that just represents increasing water use as cities grow, as industrial customers expand their facilities, those types of things. And this is the last slide that I've got, and I think there's a couple more as we'll close up and then take questions. But this is the final scenario which shows the projected 2060 water use conditions with the Comanche Peak expansion taking place. This is the maximum water use of all the scenarios that we're looking at. So this is kind of the upper end of the spectrum here. And here you see our total water use ranging from about 600,000 acre-feet per year up to 800,000 acre-feet per year in the really dry years. Again, if you compare that back to that current condition slide that we started with in scenario 1, we had water use there in most years about 300,000 and up to 500,000 in the dry years. So we're about 300,000 acre-feet per year more here. Not not all of this is from the new sales, from the system operation permits. I want to make that clear that it's hard for us to strip out, what's coming from the permit, what's coming from our existing system, because you really got to look at it all together. We've got contracts out there today that our customers aren't fully using, and as they grow through time, they're going to use more water regardless of whether we get this permit or not. So this permit, or this slide here, looks at water use from our system, both under all the current contracts that we have today, plus the contracts that we would enter if we are successful with the system operation permit. In closing, one of the things that we've been asked repeatedly from day one is, what's BRA going to do with the additional 500,000 acre feet, or what's BRA going to do with the additional 1 million acre feet, or what's BRA going to do with the 1 million acre feet from this lake or that lake. And I want to point out here that it's never been our intent to sell 1 million acre feet of additional water. This is what we're looking at, and this is water use. This is not new sales. This is total water use under what we have today and what we would get under the permit. So hopefully my intent here is to try to dispel that notion that BRA is intending to go out and sell, another time and a half amount of water versus what we have today. This is the total. So with that, I think there's a couple of wrap-up slides, and then we'll answer questions as best we can.
Yeah, I'll be very, very brief. Basically, we've concluded the Upper Basin meetings, the 3 meetings that we're going to hold for the stakeholder process in the Upper Basin. We'll have 2 more, like I said earlier, 1 tomorrow and 1 the following day. But that's not by any means your last chance to provide input. I showed you the website earlier. There will be the meetings that will be held at TCQ and also at the State Office of Administrative Hearings. We go to the next slide. We're going to file, we stated several times, we'll file the water management plan at the end of November. We'll try to have the water management plan available on the website as soon as possible. We're going to look at no later than December 3rd. And then walk through it again, TCQ about 7 months, SOA about 7 months, and then it'll go over to the State Office of Administrative Hearings. And I think that's about April 2014 timeframe. The TCQ commissioners will actually be the entities that vote whether or not to issue the permit. Like I said, there's many opportunities still left for you to participate in the process. You can go to Alston, you can write letters. We're going to provide information. Whenever we submit our water management plan, we'll provide that information on how you contact and who you contact at the TCQ and at the State Office of Administrative Hearings to provide your additional input. We'll go ahead and move to the next section. It'll be our comments period. I would ask that if you could, I think you may have received a questionnaire when you walked in. If you've got that and you want to make comments, Eric's walking around in the back. He'll hand those to me, and I'll call your name so you can come up and ask a question at the mic. Or if you don't feel comfortable, I'll be glad to read it for you. And then we'll also answer those questions on our website following this. Kind of ask if you could keep your comments to about 3-4 minutes if possible. We'll try to, we're recording this, and so if you could also, whenever you get up to the mic, if you could state your name just so it's for the record, that way we have an idea. And then also if you have a non-water management plan meeting or a non-water management plan question, you can also ask me or any of the other BRA staff that's here after the meeting. We'll try to answer those questions as well. First gentleman that I have that submitted is Steve, and I apologize, Fontner. Okay, all right. If you want to utilize that mic. Okay. All right.
No, I probably don't think people say Steve Howard. I'm Steve Porter from Granbury. I lived there for 8 years, and I think it's an opportunity to address you today. And I guess I'm even more confused than when I wrote up my little question here, because as I see the year 2060, it shows that your water requirements are about 660,000 acre feet, which is what you have today. So, and where I get my question is the article that you all in your Brazos Basin you put out, and the first article in the planning now to meet future water needs. The article states that the state of Texas requires 18 million acre-feet of water a year. Of that, the BRA is currently authorized to divert up to 661,000 acre-feet a year. In further reading your article, it goes on to state that 5.8 million acre-feet of water is lost from the Brazos into the Gulf of Mexico each year. Based on that, it appears that rather than the BRA manage the water, they are grossly mismanaging the water. How could you let that happen? As I understand your current plan, you allow water to flow downstream to meet current contracts. If downstream, the entities that purchase water do not need it, perhaps the downstream rainfall supplying needed water, you continue to let it go, and thus it runs into the Gulf. Or otherwise, with that many gallons run into the Gulf every year. If the water were being correctly managed, you could capture the water from downstream before it goes into the Gulf, and then pump the water back up to where it's committed by you. You would only need water from upstream if there were insufficient water at the point where the Gulf runs into the Gulf. At the current rate, if it is going in the Gulf, you're losing 5.3 times as many as you currently have rights to. Help me and all the people that live on the lakes upstream understand how you feel you deserve more water to waste. It is the total mismanagement of the water that you have.
I'm trying to think where I start. First of all, I guess part of what we're trying to do with this permit is be able to get a permit to use some of that water. Right now, we can't.
You're not using all your taps, you let it run into the Gulf.
No, sir. The water is...
That's what your argument is. You're charging, right? No, I did not. How did I misread it? I handed it out to you all. What did you all read from? I did not give it. I handed it out.
I saw the article as we were writing it, and I'm sorry that you don't understand what the intent there is, but right now, we don't have any control over what's happening downstream of our reservoir. We can't divert that water. We don't have the right to. And we're working on that. Have you heard of the Allen's Creek Reservoir Project? Okay, let me finish answering your question, because we're working on all those things. We had a slide up here that showed what all we were doing, working to develop additional water supply besides this permit. One of those is Allen's Creek Reservoir, and it's a reservoir that's going to be built off of the Brazos River and in the lower part of the basin, with big pumps in the Brazos to capture that water as it's flowing by, okay? We've got a water right permit to do that already. We're partnering in the project with Houston, and we expect to be building that reservoir within the next 10 years. It's not solely up to us when we build it. Houston's a part owner in that, so we're working with them on getting that built. So that's one thing that we're doing to try to capture that water. But you may, it's going to hold 150,000 acre feet. And we've got requirements in the permit that specify when we can pump water. We won't be able to pump water except when the river's up and flowing high. We'll hold that water there, and then when the customers downstream need it, that'll be another source of supply that we can use to supply them. So you raise a really good point, and that, I think, is one of the keys to meeting our state's future water needs, is being able to capture that water when it's there. And that's, again, that's one of the things that we're trying to get with this permit, is the ability to use some of that water that's downstream now that we or most other people have no right to use until you get a permit from the TCEQ. Let me finish. There are a couple other points that you made. As far as transporting that water, you know, we have the ability to build pipelines and pump stations and move water around. But if you're talking about trying to pump, you know, hundreds of thousands of millions of acre feet from the lower part of the basin at sea level up to this part of the basin or wherever where you're, you know, 500 to 700 feet above sea level, there's a tremendous energy cost there and a tremendous pumping cost, and somebody's got to pay for that. So, I don't know. I think.
So that's my point. You're mismanaging, you're letting that much water.
But we can't put it in here.
We don't want you to
Just told us you were going to build.
Well, okay. My point was, it shows your thing today said you only need in the year 2006, 700,000 acre feet. You got right now, according to your article, 661,000 acre feet. So you don't need any more to build that thing. You won't even need what you got.
Well, I understand your comments. I understand it's complicated, and I apologize that sometimes we don't do a good job of communicating it. But it's not as simple as it's what you may think. Right now, that 661,000, or however you saw the number there, that water is committed to existing customers, and they're counting on using that water. And so, right. But that water is contracted for use by the city of Granbury, by the city of Lumen, and others. And I don't think they would be very happy if we turned around and said, okay, we're going to take that water and commit it to somebody else for 30 or 40 years while you're not using it, and let them build a treatment plant and get infrastructure in place. And then once you start needing it, then we're going to take it back. I mean, honestly, that's a difficult issue. And I appreciate the question, but it's not as simple as what you may think.
Jack Matthew.
My name's Jack Matthew. I live here in Glen Rose. For years, I ran the water bridge maneuver, and I am very aware of the river. The environmental aspect of what I'm looking at more than anything. And recent years, we did, and you mentioned earlier that you released that water on Thursday, and that worked very well. But now that seems to stop, and I understand what you're saying there. But what I'm speaking for today is it's not that I want water from my property all the time. What I want is for what's out there that can't speak here, and that's the environment. The environmental studies that y'all have, they don't exist. They just don't exist because those studies are being done without ever coming down there. I personally took mine down there to the 67th bridge and showed the gauge. The gauge showed 4 feet of water. The gauge was standing on bare ground. So it's stuff like that I'm interested in. I'm interested in a constant, doesn't have to be a big flow, but a constant flow of that river for not just one person or not just for one city, but for that whole river basin. And the river that I'm familiar with, I know y'all have to deal with the whole thing. Well, the part that I'm familiar with is from Granbury to Whitney. And I'm very familiar with what goes on there. I know as much about that river as anybody in your group does about that part. The other part I know nothing about. And understand you have to put it all together. But what I'm asking for, and what I can't understand, and I understand drought conditions and stuff like that, still a steady water flow for that river before the grass river becomes grass ditch, and that it's headed there fast. And I would just like y'all to consider that environmental studies, and when you do that, then bring somebody from here that knows about that, not somebody in the office in Austin, Texas. Thank you for your time.
Frank Williamson.
I live in Granbury also, and I'm a property owner supposedly on the lake. But I'm on dry land. I'm about halfway between the dam and Granbury. And there is no way that you guys can be getting these numbers right. When you brought that consultant in that tried to explain to us that we were always going to be 98% full, even though you're going to sell all this additional water for Luna and for others, that you're now saying you're not going to sell. But when you brought him in and he started showing that 98% stuff, we don't have 98% now. How can you possibly sell more water? This year has been a normal rainfall year, right? I'm not talking about last year when you could blame the drought. I'm talking about right now. This has been a normal rainfall year. You're not anywhere close to 90% full. You have been 90% full since June. So half the year, we're going to be down. And again, I agree with what this guy said, that you can't say it's 4 foot when it's sitting on dry lake. And you guys are not measuring it right, number one. And number two, you don't have the slightest idea of where this water is when you stand up here and say the lakes are fine. Goodness, that's a mistake. Now I want to ask you a question first about the mission statement. Where does the mission statement say anything about revenue generation?
I think you read it, and it did say that.
Then why is revenue generation your biggest concern?
I don't think that we said that it was.
Well, I say it is. You're more concerned about selling the water out of this thing than you are managing.
Sir, I'm not going to be able to change your mind probably, but I can tell you, we're not concerned about the revenue for the sake of revenue. We're concerned about meeting those state water needs in the Brazos Basin. And I understand that people want the lake to be full, that we want water in the river. We want that too. I don't enjoy coming out here and you know, having to give bad news to you people or having you feel bad. I wished I could come out here and tell you, you know, things were the way that you want them to be, but I can tell you that we're saying it with as much honesty and as much ability as I can tell you what we're doing. I can't make you believe the numbers. With regard to rainfall, we have had relatively normal rainfall right here, but most of the water that comes through this part of the basin originates north of here, and they haven't had. Out above Possum Kingdom, that part of the state is still under exceptional drought conditions still, and that's affecting our water here. So it's not as simple as just looking at what's happening right here in Glen Rose or what's happening in Granbury or what's happening wherever. And you know, I empathize with you folks, but I am telling you the truth as best I know it.
Well, what concerns me is what you said a while ago. The lakes have been fine. The lakes this lake hasn't been anywhere close to fine. Now maybe if you go up to Possum Kingdom, you could say it's fine. You guys approved all these docks that are set on standards where right now, even if you can get your boat in the water, you've got 7 foot from your dock down to the boat when you drop in the water. You can't get anybody on it once you drop in the water. I mean, this thing is ridiculous, and you're sitting here saying the lakes are fine. That's what bothers me. Why don't you come out here and see how the lakes are?
Well, I've been to Granbury, and I know, and part of the problem is, I guess my definition of fine and yours are different. When I say they're fine, I guess they are. When I say they're fine, I will tell you that Granbury is more full than most of the other lakes, and I know that doesn't make y'all's problem any better, but that's the truth.
Do you know how deep Granbury is when it's completely full?
I could tell you exactly how deep it was if I looked at the sediment survey.
It's 55 feet at the dam, and as you work up, it's less. Okay, would you go along with that?
Absolutely.
You drop this lake 8 feet, and you've got thousands of boat docks that have no water. Now, you guys approved those boat docks to be built that way. Why you approved them to be built this way, and you approved Possum Kingdoms to be built as floating docks, that's something you have to explain. But you've got 3,800 docks or thereabouts down here, and you've got an average investment probably of $30,000 or $40,000 per dock, because you approved them to be built that way as opposed to floating docks. And then you don't have the water in them where we can use our property.
So you're going to start waiving the fees every year?
Yeah, the fees equate to about 26 cents per day is what they come to. The average dock fee is not very much, but part of the
problem is we're lakefront owners, so you go down to the county commission and you explain to them why we have to pay $4,400 for a 2,200 square foot home every year, because we're considered to be on the main lake.
Right. And I understand your concern, and I'm just as Brad says, I empathize with you as well. But I understand that many of the canals that were constructed on Lake.
I'm on the main lake.
Okay, and then even in the main body of the lake, as you come back up further north, The water level where we're reading it at is at the dam, and that's where we get the 4-foot low or 4.5-foot low. And you're going to see differences whenever you're in shallower water as you're going up. I guess I'm not very good at explaining
I'm
that.
saying the same thing you're saying.
Yeah.
That when you read it 4-foot low in one place, upriver, it's 8-foot low. Go up and look at our city beach and go up and look at how much water is back there.
Yeah, well, I've been by there several times.
I have one other quick comment. Sure. I attended a meeting that the Vice President of Operations of Aluminum had. And after he'd gotten to the point of talking about this stuff, I asked him, I said, what are you guys going to do when you lower this lake back to the point that it's just a river, behind the dam I'm talking about, with as far as Possum Kingdom? And how are you going to cool those 10 rods that you have out there? They said, well, if that were ever to happen, I guess we'll have to truck the water in. Now, have you thought about that at all? That we have this waste out here that has to be cooled, and it takes a lot of water to cool. And you guys are going to sell all this water out of here, regardless of what your plan says. You're going to sell it all out of here, and then you're not going to have water that can cool those rocks out of that plant.
And as Brad said earlier, I don't think I'm going to convince you that we take that under consideration, but we do. I mean, you yourself stated you don't agree with the plan or with our numbers, so I mean,
I don't think you should be asking for any more water.
Okay, well, I appreciate your comments. John Williams.
Hi guys. Hey Brad. Thanks for having us here. I appreciate y'all doing this meeting. I know we're tough on you guys. This has to do with the presentation slide where this has been brought up before about the PK availability of that water by 2025 that y'all needed. First of all, could you tell me, remember there's a slide up there that says on the upper region G, you need another 100,000 acre feet that you're going to be used. How much of that water does TCEQ claim that is available out of Possum Kingdom?
I don't know that they would claim any specific figure, Joe. Our existing permit from Possum Kingdom that we showed on that slide where we had all our water rights is, I think, right around 230,000 acre feet per year.
Right. How much? True. Right.
And the TCEQ's model shows that you could use 280,000 acre feet per year out of Possum Kingdom.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
We're working on installing an outlet structure there, and it wouldn't be fun for me to talk about that at Possum Kingdom, but we're putting a structure in the dam at the very bottom of the reservoir that would give us the ability to release essentially every drop of water in Possum Kingdom if we had to. And as I tell those folks there, we don't intend to do that, but we have to have a way to get water out of that dam. If we have a drought, 20, 30 years from now that's worse than anything we've ever seen, we've got to be prepared for the unexpected, and that's the reason that we're doing that.
Hey, how much of that water, I really is getting off the subject, I'm not talking about the water that would be available downstream. I'm talking about, it seemed like to me that what you were saying was, it seemed like the number was about 70,000 acre feet is what I remember from the previous. Are you going to be selling that directly out of Possum Kingdom before it's released? A lot of that water.
No, again, I go back to the slide that we had up here that showed what we're going to do with the water. 100,000 acre feet in Region G and about 25,000 in Region H.
Right.
Most of that water for Region G will be for the aluminum plant expansion. So most of the water that we would sell there is going to be contracted with aluminum to be used at Lake Granbury.
Okay.
And let me just keep going and addressing the question about making sure that we have enough water in Lake Granbury. That's one of the reasons that we can do that. It's not that Lake Granbury can support that on its own, but we've got our largest reservoir upstream that will supplement.
I'm really leading to one other question, and the question is, I think it's what everybody wants to know. I believe that your modeling for the study is based off the summer of 2011, right?
The modeling for our study, well, I showed you demands from 2011.
Right. Okay, so the modeling of the study, I think, is worst case scenario.
Right, that's what we're trying to do.
This is what we really want to know. And the question is if you're going to release water out of PK, or you're going to have more water sales out of PK, say 70 or 100,000 acre feet, how much lower under 2011 conditions will PK be, or will it be higher?
It won't be higher. If we have 2011 conditions when that luminant facility is here, I'm going to say some numbers off the top of my head based on modeling that we've. I don't know that I can remember the exact number, but you know the numbers from the lake management study that we presented, 2025 conditions with luminant. I think we were showing that the lake would be PK maybe 4 or 5 feet lower.
Okay, so if they were 12 feet down, they would be maybe 16, 17 feet down, say last summer.
Right,
Okay.
something on that order.
So at that point, Lake Granbury is on a 1-to-1 drawdown because we would be in a, so we would be 45 feet lower than Lake Granbury. Not according to your drawdown.
Lake Granbury would, our modeling, and you know, we've got the slides we showed.
Your drawdown, listen, your drawdown says that when PK is below 7 feet, the drawdown is 1-to-1.
Yeah, we've got a slide. Let me put the slide up there. Maybe that'll help people see what we're talking about. I know a lot of people don't like the drawdown ratio, and that, you know, some folks think that it should be more one way and others another. So let's ignore that. It's just the way that we do operate, irrespective of whether you agree with it or not. This slide kind of shows that drawdown ratio. So over here we have Possum Kingdom drawdown in feet. So right now, Possum Kingdom is a little over 7 feet low. Here we have Granbury drawdown down here. So 1 feet, 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet low. Back earlier this year, when Granbury filled up in January and stayed full through May, we were way over here. We're out of balance, and a lot of times we get criticism that we can't get water from Granbury up to PK. And so we were way over here where PK was still 4 or 5 feet low, but Granbury was full. There was no drawdown. As we went through the summer, due to water use from Lake Granbury and the environmental flow release that we make out of Lake Granbury started going down faster than Possum Kingdom. Until we got to this point right about here in September, we started making balancing releases. And so from this point on, here we're at 992 at PK, we're 7 feet low. So this point on this line right here is where we break and we go to 1-to-1. And so if we were to continue in a drought and we didn't get any rain for I don't know how long, we're going to be following this line right here. So that when PK is 12 feet low, Granbury would be 9 feet low. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I mean, that's how it would operate. You know, we don't have it going off the chart here because that's beyond what we expect to happen. But
yeah. You answered the question there. That's what we need to know. Real quick, and this will be the last part of it. You have a pipe, your pipe that's going through the PK. When's that going to be done? Probably
November this year.
November? Okay. Will it have, before the hydroelectric plant was closed, so much water, cubic feet, I don't remember what it was being released there? 197,000 cubic feet was being released every year? Is that about right?
When the hydro facilities were online, we were releasing on average, I think, 300,000.
Okay.
In the dry years, it was less, but.
Okay. First question is does that pipe have the same release capabilities?
Essentially, we can release, when the hydropower turbines were there, when both of them were running, we could release about 2,900 cubic feet per second.
Okay, when the hydroelectric plant was built, the federal government was the one that required that water be released. Now, FERC is no longer involved with that. will the BRA release that same amount of water like it was released once before as the hydroelectric plant?
We're going to release water as we need to follow this chart right here.
Okay, thank you. I guess that's no.
Thank you.
The whole bottom of the dam, how much of
2,400 cubic feet per second.
we drop gate up there, so.
About 9,000 when the lake's full, and as the lake goes down, it's less. You know, if the lake were down 13 feet, we could open a gate and nothing would come out.
We've got, right now I've got about 13 more cards, so we want to keep moving. Raymond, it looks like Baines.
I'm Raymond Haynes from Granbury. My question is, who controls BRA?
Nobody.
And is it a division of the state of Texas?
The governor of the state of Texas appoints 21 board members.
So if we want to get changes made to BRA, we need to change the governor, is that right?
But the governor appoints all the appointees of all the boards in the state.
Okay, where does the money that BRA accumulates go? I know y'all say you use it for operations. Does any of that money go back to the state?
No.
Absolutely, none of it goes to the state. So if we get an audit
We
report.
get no taxes. We get no taxes.
That's what I'm asking you. Is any of that money from BRA go into any of the state or any representatives or anything?
No.
With the exception of what we pay TCQ.
Yeah, when we pay for a permitting fee or something like that, the answer is yes.
Okay.
Our audits and our budgets are both available on our website.
Grady Hancock.
Hi, my name's Grady Hancock. I'm here from Granbury as well. And obviously, I've got some history that this is an emotional issue for most of the people who consider themselves waterfront property owners. And one of the things that you throw a lot of slides and stuff up there, but I think one of the things that you've got to do to make it a little more understandable to the layperson is, other than that drawdown graph you just showed, why don't you show just a physical graph of Lake Constantine, Lake Granbury, Lake Whitney, etc. that shows the levels as compared to what your proposal is, so that people can see side by side when your proposal is there, here's what the lake's going to look like. Because one of the things that I noticed this year, and I'm new to Granbury, by the way, I just moved from the Grapevine, but I noticed that in February we had a hell of a rain. And even though we had a horrible leap year last year, and we understand that was a drought condition, understandable. And you had to release a lot of water to accommodate for that. The lake in Granbury filled up. And I was like ecstatic. You know, I couldn't believe it. It filled up about 7 feet or 8 feet in a matter of just one rainfall. And then I found out you guys were still releasing water out of the dam.
When was that?
Earlier this year.
Well, yeah, let me address that. We get that a lot, and when the lake is full, and we call the lake full for operational purposes at 692.70, and the lake was full in February. It filled up January the 28th, 29th.
Okay, let me stop you for just a second. Okay, you said you called the lake full at what?
692.7 is the elevation.
And what does that mean to me?
That means if you go out to your dock and you look at the full water mark where the lake is when it's full, that's going to be within 1/10 of a foot or two of 692.7.
Okay.
And so when we're having flood events like we did in January or February, we probably released more water out of Lake Granbury than it would hold, because there's no place to put it when the lake gets full. We can't let it get up higher, or we're going to cause flooding issues around the lake, and we could also compromise the dam. So.
And I realize that, but when I noticed that the lake was full, and understanding you've still got to release a little bit to offset flooding conditions, When it stopped raining, the gates were still open, but the lake started going down.
Well,
And it's been consistently going down since then.
we close the gates off whenever the inflow stops. And so after the flood event's over, you know, we may have 50,000 cubic feet per second flowing into the lake and it's full, and so we're releasing 50. As that 50,000 that's flowing in goes down and eventually goes down to 1,000 to 500, we close the gates with that. This year, again, it filled up late January, it stayed full through the first part of May, and then it started slowly declining. And as it started slowly declining, part of that was due to water use from the lake, part of it's evaporation, part of it is the environmental flow release. We had the gentleman earlier that's from this part of the river, and you know, we may not be able to perfectly provide the amount of water that this gentleman thinks is needed here, and we may need to do more studies to figure out what the environment needs, but we do maintain about a 28 cubic feet per second continuous release out of Lake Granbury for the environment down here. And we do maintain that almost all the time. Right now, I mentioned earlier that sometimes we have to work around projects that are going on at the dams. And so for this summer, probably for the last 4 or 5 months, rather than just having a slow 28 CFS steady release that's there 24 hours a day, we're opening one gate a half a foot on the dam every morning for an hour and a half. And that 1.5 hour release releases the same amount of water as we would if we were doing 28 throughout the day. And so we have continued to make that release, but it's really only one component of the reason that the lake goes down in the summertime.
Yeah, and I noticed one other slide talking about the financial impact if we don't go through with your proposal, permitting proposal. And what I didn't see in the presentation tonight was what the financial impact is going to be to cities like Granbury, who are based around the lake and properties on the lake, because I can tell you that at 7 feet low, it's already unattractive and unappealing. And I go to lots of council meetings and stuff, and I see people showing up talking about, let's do this on the square, let's do that on the square. Listen, people come here for the lake, come to Granbury, they come here for the lake. If there's no water in the lake, and the property values start going down, there will be no Granbury. There won't be any reason to have anything on the square, because nobody's going to come here. And lastly, just one more thing. Do you understand I'm a lay person. I really do think you need to include those graphics of the lake, next to your proposals, because in studies, you guys are doing this every day, and I totally get that. You understand it, but I would venture, I don't want to speak for everybody, but I would venture that most people in this room are not understanding those graphs.
Okay, and I hear you, and we'll try to do better with conveying that.
Paul Parker.
You didn't answer the question. What about the economic impact that it's going to have on Granbury? That's never even responded.
Well, we haven't done an economic impact study locally at
Well, you
Granbury.
did one for yourself.
No.
You had a whole slide.
That was state water.
Let me.
I know, but what I'm saying is you do think economic
Generally, we don't look at the local economic impacts. Where we look at the reservoir, goes constructed for the water use, and we look at the water use that we're utilizing in the water. That water meet the needs of the state water department.
So at what point, when Granbury is dead as a city, is that when you guys will look at it, go, yeah, we might use
Let me make one comment. You're right. We haven't done a detailed economic study at Granbury. We haven't done one at Belton. We haven't done one at Round Rock. We haven't done one at Georgetown. We haven't done them locally. We've got every location in the basin could tell us you need to do a local study for our area. We haven't done that. What we showed you was impacts from the state water plan. That's the state of Texas's plan. It's not our plan, but they're looking at the impacts of not meeting needs. But if you bear with me, one point that I want to make, and I understand that many of you don't trust the models and don't trust the numbers and things, but I think part of what I'd like to communicate to you is that Lake Granbury's a little over 4 feet low today, and it got down 8 feet low. Well, it's, the water surface is flat, so it's the same depth everywhere. It's just that if you're, okay, well, let me move on, and I'm not going to argue about that. The point I want to make is this. The lake's not always going to be low, and I think that part of the conception is you know, the lake's always going to be empty, and that's not the case. That's not the case. And before we had these dry years, and that's part of the problem. We're out here doing these meetings right after the worst drought we've ever had in the world in 2011, and we fully haven't recovered now. If you would have looked, you know, if we think back to Lake Granbury from, I believe, October of 2009, for 18 months straight, it was completely full for a year and a half. And that was after hydropower was shut down. That was no water coming from hydro. That was just, we were having normal conditions. And I understand that you people want the lakes to be full, and I do too. But I ask you to not jump to conclusions that because what you see in a drought year or what you see right now is going to be the new normal forever. Because it's not. The lake's going to be full a good bit of the time. If our numbers aren't exactly right, that's the best I can do.
Okay, Paul Parker, I'm also from Granbury. I have a misunderstanding with our relationship with Whitney. I noticed on our chart, we take 64,000 acre feet out of Granbury, 16 or 18 out of Whitney. And last year we were full, 18 feet. First February somewhere we were full. I don't know the date. First in March, June, April, somewhere we were a foot or two low. I look in the paper, and Whitney's a foot low, and we're a foot and a half, 2 foot low. Why are, with Whitney, a flood control lake, why are we taking water out of Granbury, which has no capacity to hold any water, and leaving it in Whitney, or sending it to Whitney? I mean, we're just passing it through Whitney's, they're staying higher than we are. 2 inches out of Whitney is about 2 feet out of Granbury.
Yeah. Well, again, this year, when Granbury started declining in mid-May or so, the only water that we released was that environmental flow release. So we weren't moving water out of Lake Granbury. We were releasing the 28 cubic feet per second, or that's equivalent for a day. Well, I think you can ask these folks here in Glen Rose. They'll tell you that river hasn't looked good all year long. So we haven't been.
That water going to the power plant, not down the river.
Well, what I picked up from tonight, in the conversation I had last night, are we drawing down out of Granbury because PK is full?
No.
I mean, but they're low and we're full.
No,
we take it out of Granbury.
We do not do that.
The ratio that you have in the park.
No, sir. We don't lower Granbury just because PK is low, and that's probably something that we could have done a better job communicating in 2011 when we did that study. What happens, like this year, Granbury filled up, PK stayed low. We didn't automatically start bringing Granbury down. We maintained that environmental flow release, and the customers from the lake continued to use water, and Mother Nature evaporated water, and that's why the lake went down.
Well, that was perception we had.
That's all right.
Pauline, Stevie.
I had a different question that someone answered. On your recreational purposes is very low on your mission statement. Would you tell me why you gave a contract to provide water to fill a ski lake?
I don't recall, and I don't even know if that contract is still in effect.
It's full all the time. And it's its
Where's the lake?
You're referring to the Lake September Cove. There's a lot of, I'm sorry, they asked me to speak in the mic. You're referring to the Lake September Cove. I'll have to go back and check. I know at one point we did have a water contract with that entity.
So why would you have a contract with somebody who's purely for recreational purposes?
Yeah, probably at the time, no. At the time, they asked for the water, and we had that water available. At this time, if they were to come forward, we wouldn't have that water available. No, I mean, it's got to meet whatever our guidelines are at that point. Yeah, recreational as far as the appropriation of state water, right. But we probably had the water available at the time. There weren't other people asking for water, and so then it met the criteria. All right. I'm sorry, I didn't. They said we'll research that file and we'll post the answer on the website for you. Neil Carroll.
I'm Neil Carroll. I'm over from Comanche County. My dad and I have been growing crops and running cattle over there for many, many years. And we've had water permits from our reservoirs running into Lake Proctor since the early 80s. And we're doing all we can on our part as far as making sure all of our water usage is very limited, trying to do all we can with legal systems and everything we've been able to keep our water usage as low as possible for our crops. And you know, my main thing is listening, and I understand all the concerns here, but I full well know that the water table in aquifer in West Texas and in the plains is going down. And it's not being replenished like they thought it once was. And they're within about 9 years here of having a major impact in that area as far as sustainable agriculture for this whole country. And we've been diligently fighting to maintain our permits. All these years, just getting a permit for just a temporary permit alone, and just have reapply. And it shouldn't be about to maintain food and agriculture that this state needs to sustain the people and the populations in which you're saying is growing. And I'm trying to get a good understanding of the philosophy and everything that's going behind this to explain to the people here within this state of how we're going to sustain the people here if we don't have the agriculture to produce the food for it. So I guess my question is, you know, whenever I get a response back to say, you guys can't pump because, and we have the water there in our reservoirs, it's on our land, but yet we get the response back, you know, you can't pump because Lake Proctor's down to a certain level, but yet we shut off, and then we sit there and watch the moisture from these lakes wither away. We just sit there and watch them go, and because of evaporation. You know full well what I mean, and it goes in a hurry. So, you know, we only have a short amount of time to seize the moment, as you could say, to put it out there and grow the crops and everything we need to sustain the people here. But there is a valid concern here about West Texas and Northwest Texas in the Panhandle region about that aquifer. And I need you guys to get really on board with understanding of how we need to continue to sustain agriculture within this state and have a process within your guidelines set up for that.
George Bingham.
You can probably guess on the farm too. And got a few complaints. But y'all want y'all's permit renewed to 1,300,000 acre feet. But you don't anticipate using but 700,000 acre feet by 2060, is that right?
Yeah, I think it was close to 800,000 acre feet.
Well, my question is, why is that water, Lake Proctor watershed, why is it all of, none of it would be appropriate? I mean, it's all been appropriated. And like Neil said, we've been here we've been using this water since the 70s. Early 70s. We have filed every 7 years, 9 years, 10 years, get it renewed. And we're not using the water. And we asked for it first. The law reads, first in time, first in right. That goes with water permits. You know, that's what it was written in there for. It's water permits. And we asked for the water before you guys did. So we should be senior to y'all in these permits. But no, we're carrying a small stick and we don't have many to punch.
Mr. Bingham, I apologize. Earlier I mentioned there's some things that are discussed. It's a contested case hearing, and so I appreciate your comments, but that's one of the issues we can't respond to.
I can't discuss that.
I'm gonna let you talk, but I can't respond.
What's this hearing for?
Our water management plan, but you can participate in this SOA permitting process.
How come that ain't part of the water management plan? Because like Neil said, when you set your grandkids and children down to a fresh bowl of water for breakfast when there's no food, then you're going to say, I made a mistake in my decision.
Appreciate your comments. Michelle Malloy.
My name is Michelle Malloy. I just moved here in May and purchased the low water heater in the business. I was at the meeting in Granbury back in June. Seems like it was longer than that. That was a much better presentation than this one. Much better, more information, and it was definitely better done. And you had a nice people here that were reading at the front, and I just feel that this is kind of real informative. I brought some slides that I was hoping that you could stick in to show the river. We took them north of the 67 bridge. When I came out here tonight, I wasn't going to talk. It's emotional. I want to know how much the 28 cubic feet per second for 90 minutes ends up down here at the river. Everybody's talking about the lake and dam and all the other stuff, but my concern is the river and the environment of the river. When you look at these slides, you'll see black sludge and slime and a lot of other things. But the thing is, I called TCEQ earlier this year when I had a complaint from a customer about stagnant water. She went tubing, came back early and said there's stagnant water, and the woman's yelling at me. Well, I told her the only thing I can do is refer her to you, Mike. This is all my phone calls went to. So, and I know you got inundated with calls by customers complaining because we have to ask for their number. So, sorry about that, but that's what you're there for. I was told by the man at the TCEQ that the water would be tested. What I ended up getting was a letter back from him telling me that he contacted the DRA and there's any problem with the water. He never came out there and tested it. There's several places, if you could show that slide. It's just a small bit. The guy with my card.
There's what?
Hiding it.
I have that card.
No, I know. I gave him a CD to see if I could put that in, just to show him. You know, there was last meeting in June, there was something about water studies that were supposed to be done in the Glen Rose area. Have those water studies been completed and published yet?
Tiffany Morgan's our environmental services manager.
The studies you're speaking of that you want, the in-stream flow studies, have not been completed. They will be multi-year, probably 5+ year studies to monitor fish, aquatic mussels, aquatic plants. We need to do riparian assessments along that entire thing over a variety of stream flows. If we happen to get all those stream flows next year, it could go faster, but our best estimate is probably over the next 5 years. There is routine water quality monitoring in that segment. It's downstream of the 67 bridge, and I believe it's County Road 212. That is a monthly sampling water quality site. All that data is available through our website if you want to look at it. So far, it does not indicate any impairment of any surface water quality standard, even when it's low.
Okay, so any stagnant water north of the 67 bridge that we're trying to report that there's a problem by other residents that live on the street, the water's not being tested and the TCEQ just refers it back to the VRA. If you can't get the TCEQ to do anything, you can't get the VRA to do it. And this 28 cubic feet per second that you let out for 90 minutes, by the time it gets to us, it's either dried up or pumped out. There's nothing coming through that area. It's flat dry.
There's a gauge, you know where the USGS gauge location?
Yeah, we know where the gauge is. Okay. The one that says it's 4 feet and you're standing on dry rock. Yeah, I know.
Well, when we get back to the office tomorrow, I can call USGS, and I think if you look back at that gauge data, they send people out there periodically to make sure that gauge is functioning, and if it's not, they correct it.
Well, is there a way for me to contact them so the next time they go out there, I can go with them, they can educate me?
Perhaps, let me tell you, I'll do this for you. Whenever I talk to them about that, I'll see if I can arrange for them to contact you when they come, because we do rely on those gauges, and we do ask them to go out there and check that one periodically, and they've probably been out there 3 or 4 times this summer. And when they go out there, they actually get in the river and measure the flow, and I think every time that they've been, granted, 28 CFS is not a lot of water from your perspective.
Not for 36 hours, it takes 36 hours to get from Granbury where I'm at. And
right.
How much of that gets there?
All of it is getting there, but it's not getting there in the spike. What we're doing, we're not releasing 28 CFS for an hour and a half. We're releasing 450. So if you go to that dam, and Connie is here.
That's not what your website says.
Well, it's equivalent to 28 CFS for all day long. Again, we're working on those low flow gates, and so we can't do it like we normally do. So we open a gate on the dam for an hour and a half for each morning, and during that hour and a half, there's 450 cubic feet per second that's coming out of that dam. So if you're standing below it, there's a tremendous amount of water that's coming out for that hour and a half. By the time it makes its way down to Glen Rose, that water spreads out. And by the time it gets to Glen Rose, it's 28 CFS, and that's the reason we make the release for an hour and a half. It's because that's the equivalent amount of water that we would be doing if the low flow gates were operating. And Ms. Moley, I understand, and I talked to Mike and Judy, and it makes my stomach hurt whenever I know that you called, because I know. Not because you called, but because I understand.
I told you to come ride down the river. You see for yourself. I won't even charge you for the canoe. I just want you to see what we see. When I've got customers coming, this is a lot of water right here at the bottom of the bridge. That is a lot of water. And there's water right there in front, right there. That's a lot. That's the bridge 2 days ago. This is all from the last couple of days.
So for the folks at Lake Granbury, we're not releasing all your water downstream. That's what this picture shows. I want to make sure we get that across.
Yeah, but when the fish can't even swim down the river, there's a problem. Anyway, those were some videos that I guess they let you play, so it's okay. I just wanted you to see it is dry, and it's sad.
And I will contact USGS and I will try to put them in touch so you can go and see. One thing, the 4 feet, when they show it's a 4-foot stage, they're not saying there's 4 feet of water. They're saying that the elevation that they're measuring from wherever that is 4 feet. And whenever they're at that level, the flow here is 28 square feet. I'll talk to you about that offline. I'll talk to you about it offline. I don't want to get there.
I appreciate your time, but you know, I've tried really hard. And for like 6 months, I've been hard.
It's Rick. Looks like Kinley, maybe.
Did you know that?
Sorry, I heard you in this line.
And the mic would be preferable.
Hopefully this will be quick. A lot of its definition. As an overview though, kind of this system operations permitted water management. They're specifically asking to A, sell more water, and B, capture more water. Are those two statements correct?
Yeah, I think the first one for certain. We can't put any more water in these lakes when they're full and they're there.
Right.
But we are seeking to make use of that additional water downstream. We will enter more contracts for this work.
And for some reason you alluded to the ability to capture more water. You're saying through water runoff and direct usage, like waste treatment.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yeah, when I say the use of the word capture, I don't know if we're on the same page. Whenever I was showing the slide with the drainage area downstream of the reservoir.
Yeah, the big white area. You're going to capture more water.
So, and customers that we have down there, when they need water, they can pump it out of the river when it's there without us having to release it. That's mainly what we're talking about there. So if you want to think of it capture, we're allowing them to capture that water and use it as it's going by rather than us having to release water for it.
So when you say capture more water, that means for the consumer or somebody to take more water.
Correct. It would be a water customer.
It has not, capture more water doesn't mean that you're going to gain more water to the system.
Not necessarily stored, except in the answer to this man's question on Allen's Creek and some other projects like that, we are seeking to take it out of the river and put it somewhere else and store it for use later.
So capturing more water is taking water out. Selling water is taking water out. So you're asking to sell more water and take more water out. But both are taking more water out. Is that correct?
Well, keep going with your question.
No, I'm simple. I got to go one step at a time.
Well, I think the capture more water, I don't know that we're asking to capture more water. We're asking to be able to make more water available from the system, and a lot of times that water would be able to be taken directly from the river. Other times it's going to have to come from where we currently have it.
Permit to capture water and run. That's what I got.
Did we have, I don't recall if we had a slide there that said.
No, there's a statement.
Okay.
You're wanting to capture more water and run. But that capture means allowing more people to take more water out. Because they're not permanent. So you want to generate more permits. You want this here is going to give you the authority to issue more permits. That's what capture does, right?
Is going to give us a permit. This is
That
going
will-
to give us a permit that will give us a greater amount of water in the basin.
To sell.
So,
The only reason you need a permit is so you can sell it.
Right.
Or capture it.
Right.
And capture means somebody's capturing it, like me as a farmer would capture that water.
Right. We had that slide up there, and the end result of this permit is we're gonna sell it in accordance with the state water plan. And right now, we had that slide that showed 100,000 acre feet region D and 25 in H, and that's Lumina is gonna buy some of it for the power plant. We've got people on a waiting list right now in the lower part of the basin. City of Sugar Land and Gulf Coast Water Authority and municipalities that need water down there that we can't provide today.
Because you don't have the permit.
Correct.
But, okay, so I understand, so capture and sell more rivers. Okay, so I'm kind of understanding that. Define lowest model storage that you had in the previous slide.
Yeah, that's where we run that water availability model in these 5 scenarios that we ran. I showed you the 5 scenarios there at the end. The first scenario was current conditions. And when we run TCEQ's water availability model based on our current demands, the lowest volume of storage that we have today, when everything's full, it's 100% full. Okay? The model showed that based on our current water use, the lowest we would get in that worst drought period in the 50s was 42% full.
42% full.
So
if you could even the playing field, all the reservoirs would be 42%.
Right.
That doesn't really happen, but
right.
That in the perfect world, that's just measuring water.
Right.
Now, you said something interesting that there's more water in PK. I wrote, and I didn't bring my glasses in, I can't even read what I wrote. It's getting old, I tell you, I can't see anything anymore. You got some Spanish there? I was writing in the dark, and now I can't read it. Okay, there's more water in PK, more than water lakes exist. So basically what you're saying is that there's more water that we can sell in PK than we're currently selling. Is that correct? Is that what that statement means?
Yeah, that's one of the components of the supply that's available from this permit. That's one of the things that makes it able for us to sell it.
And the reservoirs supply more water than the current yield, which means the reservoir supply that we have, do you equate yield to permits, to what you're selling now? That's your yield, right?
Well,
that's essentially your yield is what you're permitted to sell. That's 100% yield is 100% of that permit, right?
I think, yeah, I can go along with that. It's not quite right, but it's pretty close.
I'm trying to understand a little business.
Well,
I mean, that's kind of what you are, right?
Well, let me tell you, and I don't want to take too much time, but when we got our original permits from the TCEQ, and we've received those permits, the ones that we have already, the ones for each lake, we've received those at different times through history. And most of those permits were issued based on the 2020 yield of the reservoir. So when we got them 50 years ago or 40 years ago, the TCEQ showed that that's how much water they thought we could take out of that reservoir every year through the drought record and not run short in the year 2020. So when we talk about yield, the yield today is different from when it'll be 100 years from now because the reservoirs are filling up with sediment. So when we talk about yield, it's time dependent as well.
And those statements basically are saying the supply, you're basically saying, to justify this, you're saying the overall supply exceeds what the current yield is.
Yeah, we can supply more than what our permits.
Which we do right now.
Yes.
Okay. So, senior water rights, either as a percentage or whatever, of the total permitted water that you have now, what percentage of that is the senior water rights?
Well,
50%, less or greater than 50%?
Let me explain senior water rights, because that's a point of confusion. When every water right in the basin is senior to something. So when we say senior and junior water rights, there's only one water right in the basin that's senior to everything, and that's the very first water right that was issued by TCEQ. And there's probably a water right with a date somewhere around 1900.
And what do you mean when you say senior water rights?
That's
an obligation in that slide. One of your obligations was a commitment to senior water rights, which had to have a volume or a number or percentage.
Right. Well, it depends on what the dates of those are, because all of our reservoirs have a priority date. In other words, that's where they fall in line in priority and water rights. And so every water right that's ever been issued has a different date. And so if I have a water right that's for 5,000 acre feet with a priority date of 1950, and you have a water right with a priority date of 1951 for 5,000 acre feet, under state law, I get all of my water before you get any of yours. And so there are water rights that are senior to every one of our reservoirs. There are some old rights that go back before PK. And when we get into really dry conditions, and they're not getting the flow that they need in the river, if we happen to have inflow into our reservoirs, we're obligated to pass that water through the reservoir for those guys downstream. Okay, does that make sense? Because their water right is priority over that reservoir because they had it first.
Right. And there seems to be a big definition between that white area and the rest of the area up north. And you were talking about, again, capturing water or somehow unappropriated returns. Now, you make use of return flows of unappropriated returns. How do you have more? A return is that water that flows in?
It's water that's coming out of wastewater treatment plants.
So somehow that right now is not getting dumped into the waters.
It is, but we don't have the ability to use it because we
you don't have a permit to sell it. That's what you're telling me.
I know it's getting a little late. We'll stay up here as long as possible. You've got a lot of specific questions. Is that something we can meet off to the side and discuss with you?
Well, you use a lot of different terms here to basically say the same thing, that from what we've just conversed about is you're basically telling me that all this permit is asking for is to, you're not increasing any water at all, like your monkey ears tend to talk about here. All you're asking for is a permit to sell more water. You're not obtaining any more water. But that same return flow and unappropriated returns are still flowing in.
Right.
The volume of water is the same. We're not, tomorrow or next year, the volume of water is not going to get any greater.
Right. We can't make it rain more. It's going to rain the same as it always has, and we're not building any new reservoirs. And that's one of the reasons that we're doing this, is to better use what we have today. We get a lot of feedback that we're mismanaging everything. We're trying to manage the system better and meet more needs out of what we have.
So at the end of the day, we're just asking to sell more water, period. That's all we're trying to do. We're doing that. And from this area up here, at the end of the day, you want to take 100,000, specifically from this region,
from region G,
to supply down to the white region.
No.
To supply for the use of this region.
Yeah, most of it's for the use of that lignite power plant,
which is
the Comanche Peak.
The nuke.
Yes.
Okay, so that nuke. Well, the whole other regime. I mean, when you get to the nukes, you've got to. So that nuke just basically burns it up in that way. And that's what you need nukes for.
Charles Peoples.
Charles Peoples, and I live on Lake Granbury. I had 3 cards there, but 2 of the issues have already been addressed. So my final issue is, in January in Austin, the VRA said it would take 2 years to do a proper water management study. So I'm wondering how you've managed to accomplish that in about 9 months. And the second part of that question is, why didn't you do it between 2004 and 2011?
Thank you.
You may argue with our logic on how we approached it, and I can't argue if you disagree with us, but we applied for this permit in 2004. And when we applied to the permit, there were a lot of things that exist today that weren't even in play, that we'd never even heard about the plant at Lumen being expanded. A lot of the customers that need water today, we didn't know that back then. We were looking for a permit to be able to use additional water from the system, and so we submitted an application to TCEQ that gave some boundary conditions on how much water we could get from this system, hypothetically, if we took it all at 1 of 3 locations. We can't do a management plan for using water as well as we would like to unless we know what the permit's going to say. So that we've got to have something that puts some fences around what we can do. And right or wrong, our approach was to file a permit application. And if you go back and read that application, it's posted on our website, and it's somewhere in the first few pages. We contemplated from day one that we would have to do the water management plan before we ever used a drop of the water, and that's in that 2004 application. We were wanting to get a permit so that we would have those boundaries to work within, so that we would know what the limits were, because it's hard to do a water management plan without specifically knowing who you might sell the water to or how much water the state may give you. If they only gave us 20,000 acre feet, then a management plan to sell 100,000 wouldn't be good, because we wouldn't be permitted to do it. So that's the reason that we took that approach. The second part of your question, that the original permit that was published by the TCEQ in 2011 after the hearings last year has a provision in there that required us to do what we're doing now in a 3-year period. And that was the time frame that we were going to work on to do it. In January, those commissioners gave us 10 months. For those of you that were there, they said, we think 10 months ought to be good enough, so that's the deadline and no extensions. And we've been working as hard as we can to get that done.
So the new plan has the actual points of taking the water instead of the 3 hypothetical?
Yes, those maps that we showed the segments. Again, 100,000 in Region G, with most of that coming from the nuclear plant like Granbury. There's, I think, maybe 10,000 acre feet or so of it that is spread out in a couple of segments a little bit further downstream in Region G, and then the remainder would be sold in that Region H area. So we have tried to do that in some of these scenarios. When you see the plan in Section 4, we'll describe, assuming the limited expansion takes place and these other things happen, this is where we plan to use that water.
It's Mark Frella.
Thank you.
Did you say, did I read the last name right?
Yeah, very good.
Grella? Okay.
I had a question and then a couple comments. The question was the drawdown protocol that's currently in place between TK and Granbury, or 1.75 to 1 and 1.92, right? So it's in that case. I'm a Lake Granbury water. The question I have is, will that protocol be a part of the water management plan that goes to state approval that would be locked in for future, or is it something you do on your own on the side?
We are proposing that that's how we plan to operate for this next 10-year period. One of the things, we have to update the management plan every 10 years. And so we're proposing for this first management plan that we're going to operate to that protocol.
So as that plan gets down in cost and goes through the contested hearing and everything, that would be the place to argue it, change it, or in the meantime?
Yes. Yes, sir. That would be one place. I mean, that may not be the only place that you might argue or challenge it, but that would be one place.
Well, great. I'm trying to understand how to kind of go back in time. It's a little hard to do that sometimes. You put that in place in April. I'm new to here.
Right.
But I kind of looked at the whole study. It looked quite well done. The firm you used was great. I think it was almost $200,000 study. If there's a fact you're trying to get at, it's in there. Perfect.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
And I would compliment you on that. I just wrote a couple letters around town, and maybe you saw, they published my letter to the editor last Saturday.
Yes, sir.
That was me.
Okay.
That was me.
We were wondering if you were going to be here.
I am here, and the title of the article was "The Devil's in the Details," right? Yeah. The two details that, I have a background in modeling and finance and marketing, did it for many, many years. But there's two assumptions that I would challenge here, and I'll try to challenge in the future if this is the place to change it. I hope to make progress changing your mind, but I think that is probably not going to happen here. The first one is how you define fair. Because you, to some degree, did recognize economic impact because you did the study. Is that fair? So you can't say that you don't consider economic impact. You already have.
We tried.
Spent a lot of money, and you gave it a good shot. The thing that I would contest, and maybe it was discussed and debated during the study, or maybe it was just accepted as a reasonable way to do it, was the same percent of docks or facilities out of service at both lakes at the drawdown rate you would assume to be what you're going to use. Fair to say?
Yes, sir.
Is everyone familiar with that? Okay. You notice how our lake level gravitated toward the drawdown rates over the summer. We could have released more water out of PK, so they kept our lake full, but that's not the drawdown rate.
That's right.
Fair? Okay, fair. I would challenge the definition of fair. If you were saying that if 50% of the docks are out of use in PK, then 50% ought to be out of use here. Well, there's a couple things that are different. We're pretty much all fixed docks, right? They're pretty much all floating docks. That's one issue. The other issue is you assumed they were in service if they had 2 feet of water underneath any dock. Well, that just doesn't work. Floating dock, you just walk down the ramp a little steeper. Here it's unsafe. I mean, even if you have 5 feet of water left, I can't get down. I can't get my boat down. The cable system doesn't work with the boat. So I would challenge that. And I would also challenge that that's an assumption you could have. Is it, how do you pronounce the firm? Is it work?
Half.
Half. I assume they're setting with the model in the computer database and could modify that model for a nominal fee any way you want. I would request that you change 2 assumptions and see what the result is. I sort of did it on my own calculator. Right? You probably read the article. One is fair being a dock per dock. They have half the docks we do. We have twice what they do. They were modeling percentages. So, in other words, today's model, they'd be down 500 docks, we're down like 1,300. I think that's I would argue that if you test the extreme, go to the extreme, pretend we only had 2 docks or 10 docks, and we had 3,000, which is what we have. If they were down 50%, that might be 1, 2, or 3 docks, depending on. If they had 100, they're down 50 docks, we're down 1,200. That economically doesn't make any sense. So the definition of fair needs to be dock per dock. If they're down a dock, we're down a dock. If they're down there 500, which they are today according to the models, we should only have 500 docks out of service, not 1,200 or 1,300. If you change the simple definition of fair, the drawdown rate would be 3.2, 3.3 to 1. We would have a half more water right now because you would have migrated us to a different slope. Exhibit 44, right? So the drawdown rate is very important, would you agree? Especially if we're going to lock it in for 10 years. Right? I think it probably really should be somewhere in the 3 to 4. I would suggest that some of those scenarios be looked at with Pat and brought to the table at the next meeting or the next meeting so that the public can say, you know, I understand if we use a different definition, it's a different answer. But it's just an assumption. It's your definition of fair.
And I agree. I can't argue that we may not be able to ultimately agree. What your definition of fair may be different, and I understand your argument. I will tell you that when we were developing that study, we had discussions on what is fair. We had discussions on what should be our assumption for, out of service. We had meetings at Granbury and we had meetings at Possum Kingdom, and I can tell you that at Possum Kingdom, the comment about the 2 foot was, that only works for the fixed docks because our docks are floating and this lake goes down, the ramp gets so steep that we can't use them. So we need to have 6 feet or 5 feet under our docks.
They need better docks. They just need something that doesn't slip off.
And so I'm not arguing with your point. You're right. We made assumptions for that study. We did the best that we could, and it was, quote, the definition that we picked for fair.
So I just want to challenge that, and I'm trying to understand where to do it effectively. Is it a lawsuit? Is it the city? Is it the county? Or is it the state? Because I think you're pretty married to your assumption, right?
We're pretty married to it.
But you're not completely married.
Maybe we get a committee of PK dock owners and Granbury dock owners to help us with the next time to come up with what's fair. I mean, and really, I felt like when we went and did those public meetings similar to this, we had 100 people or so at Granbury, and then we had 70 or so people at PK,
right?
And 90% of the people at both meetings thought it was unfair.
Well,
one way or the other.
My point is there at some point maybe a judge or a jury ought to weigh in on this rather than just us arguing with you. Third party. Fair? Because I can make just as good an argument for a dock.
Well, let me and you can, and I don't want to debate.
But I want to mind you.
I read your article, and if it's 1 to 1, and there's 1,300 docks at PK, If all of them are out of service, is it fair that there's still 1,300 in service at Granbury?
Economically, yes. They're like 4 times larger by volume, twice the surface area, twice the depth. Right? I got the numbers. There's a lot of reasons, yes, it is fair. Because they test the extreme again. If you had 2 docks
so it's fair.
And we have 3,000. If they're down 50%, that would be 1 dock, right? Is my math correct? All right. We would be down 15%. What's the logic in that?
We don't
they
have
have the
to
same
go.
number of. You just agreed that doesn't make sense.
If we had 2 docks, it would.
Okay, but if they had 100, would it make sense?
I don't want to debate here. I understand your point, and I agree that different people are going to look at it different ways. That's what we picked. We are kind of married to that right now, and so if you want to challenge that,
what's your suggestion?
I don't want to give you a good one.
State Senator, PCQ.
PCQ hearing. That way you'll be recognized by the SOA.
I'm trying to understand where to invest my time and energy because I think those two assumptions were fundamentally flawed. And the slope of the line at Granbury, after about 4 feet, it goes straight up. You can't use 6 docks after about 3 or 4 feet. You can't get there. They're dangerous.
No, I think this is important because it gets to a question that was asked earlier, and that has to do with accountability. And so I want to address it because I think we could have gone into it a little bit more earlier. And the accountability part's important because this permitting process isn't over. Obviously, as Mike showed you earlier, we have almost 2 more years of discussion on this, both at TCQ and at SOA. So there are at least 2 venues there wherein you could have a discussion on this topic. Additionally, in addition to having a board of 21 members that are appointed by the governor, the Brazos River Authority was created by the state of Texas. You know, that is who formed us. We're one of about 16 different river authorities that have similar functions. We are seeking to sell more water because that's what the state created us to do. That is our job. We only have a certain amount of water left to sell. It's all contracted out. So we're seeking to appropriate more so that we can sell and provide more. Again, it's the reason that we were created. We can only operate by the enabling statutes that exist in
Mark Brella.
Thank you.
Did you say, did I read the last name right?
Yeah, very good. Brella.
Okay.
I had a question and then a couple comments. The question was the drawdown protocol that's currently in place between PK and Granbury, or 1.75 to 1 and 1.92, right? So it's in that case. I'm a Lake Granbury West. The question I had is, will that protocol be a part of the water management plan that goes to state approval that would be locked in for future, or is it something you do on your own on the side?
We are proposing that that's how we plan to operate for this next 10-year period. One of the things, we have to update the management plan every 10 years. And so we're proposing for this first management plan that we're going to operate to that protocol.
So as that plan gets down in cost and goes through the contested hearing and everything, that would be the place to argue it, change it, or in the meantime.
Yes. Yes, sir. That would be one place. I mean, that may not be the only place that you might argue or challenge it, but that would be one place.
Well, great. I'm trying to understand how to kind of go back in time. It's a little hard to do that sometimes. You put that in place in April. I'm new to here.
Right.
But I kind of looked at the whole stuff. It looked quite well done. The firm you used was great. I think it was almost $200,000 study. If there's a fact you're trying to get at, it's in there. Sure, thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
And I would compliment you on that. I just wrote a couple letters around town. Maybe you saw, they published my letter at the editor last Saturday.
Yes, sir.
That was me.
Okay.
That was me.
We were wondering if you were going to be here.
I am here, and the title of the article was "The Devil's in the Details," right? The 2 details that, I have a background in modeling and finance and marketing. Did it for many, many years. But there's 2 assumptions that I would challenge here, and I'll try to challenge in the future if this is the place to change it. I hope to make progress changing your mind, but I think that it's probably not going to happen here. The first one is how you define fair. because you, to some degree, did recognize economic impact because you did the study. Is that fair? So you can't say that you don't consider economic impact. You already have.
We tried.
Spent a lot of money, and you gave it a good shot. The thing that I would contest, and maybe it was discussed and debated during the study, or maybe it was just accepted as a reasonable way to do it, was the same percent of docks or facilities out of service at both lakes at the drawdown rates you would assume to be what you're going to use. Fair to say?
Yes, sir.
Is everyone familiar with that? Okay. You notice how our lake level gravitated toward the drawdown rates over the summer. We could have released more water out of PK, so they kept hardly full, but that's not the drawdown rate.
That's right.
Fair? Okay. I would challenge the definition of fair. If you were saying that if 50% of the docks are out of use in PK, then 50% ought to be out of use here. Well, there's a couple things that are different. We're pretty much all fixed docks, right? They're pretty much all floating docks. That's one issue. The other issue is you assumed they were in service if they had 2 feet of water underneath any dock. Well, that just doesn't work. Floating dock, you just walk down the ramp a little steeper. Here it's unsafe. I mean, even if you have 5 feet of water left, I can't get down. I can't get my boat down. The cable system doesn't work with the boat. So I would challenge that. And I would also challenge that that's an assumption you could have. Is it, how do you pronounce the firm? Does it work? Half. I assume they're setting with the model in the computer database and could modify that model for a nominal fee any way you want. I would request that you change 2 assumptions and see what the result is. I sort of did it on my own calculator. Right? You probably read the article. One is fair being a dock per dock. They have half the docks we do. We have twice what they do. They were modeling percentages. So, in other words, today's model, they'd be down 500 docks, we're down like 1,300. I would argue that if you test the extreme, go to the extreme, pretend they only had 2 docks or 10 docks, and we had 3,000, which is what we have. If they were down 50%, that might be 1, 2, or 3 docks, depending on. They had 100, they're down 50 docks, we're down 1,200. That economically doesn't make any sense. So the definition of fair needs to be dock per dock. If they're down a dock, we're down a dock. If they're down there 500, which they are today according to the models, we should only have 500 docks out of service, not 1,200 or 1,300. If you change the simple definition of fair, the drawdown rate would be 3.2, 3.3 to 1. We would have a foot and a half more water right now because you would have migrated us to a different slope. Exhibit 44, right? So the drawdown rate is very important, would you agree? Especially if we're going to lock it in for 10 years. Right? I think it probably really should be somewhere in the 3 to 4. I would suggest that some of those scenarios be looked at with half and brought to the table at the next meeting or the next meeting so that the public can say, you know, I understand if we use a different definition, it's a different answer. But it's just an assumption. It's your definition of fair.
And I agree. I can't argue that we may not be able to ultimately agree. What your definition of fair may be different, and I understand your argument. I will tell you that when we were developing that study, we had discussions on what is fair. We had discussions on what should be our assumption for, out of service. We had meetings at Granbury and we had meetings at Possum Kingdom, and I can tell you that at Possum Kingdom, the comment about the 2 foot was, that only works for the fixed docks because our docks are floating and this lake goes down, the ramp is so steep that we can't use them. So we need to have 6 feet or 5 feet under our dock.
They need better docks. They need something that doesn't slip.
And so I'm not arguing with your point. You're right. We made assumptions for that study. We did the best that we could, and it was, quote, the definition that we picked for fair.
So I just want to challenge that, and I'm trying to understand where to do it effectively. Is it a lawsuit? Is it the city? Is it the county? Or is it the state? Because I think you're pretty married to your assumption, right?
We're pretty married to it.
But you're not completely married.
Maybe we get a committee of PK dock owners and Granbury dock owners to help us with it next time to come up with what's fair. I mean, and really, I felt like when we went and did those public meetings similar to this, we had, 100 people or so at Granbury, and then we had 70 or so people at PK.
Right.
And 90% of the people at both meetings thought it was unfair.
Well,
One way or the other.
My point is, there, at some point, maybe a judge or a jury ought to weigh in on this, rather than just us